Every morning at exactly 6:40, Silas Turner placed a warm cup of coffee into the trembling hands of a homeless woman sitting outside his diner. No questions, no pity, just quiet kindness. For months, no one noticed, until one cold morning, 3 black SUVs pulled up. Men in tailored suits stepped out, scanning the street with sharp, methodical eyes. Then one of them pointed straight at Silas, and the woman on the sidewalk slowly stood up, no longer shaking. What happened next made the entire city realize they had been watching the wrong person all along. Silas Turner was 38 years old, and he had the kind of face that looked 10 years older than it was, not from vanity or neglect, but from the particular exhaustion of a man who carried too much weight for too long without anyone offering to help. He owned a small diner on Callaway Street in the working-class neighborhood of Denton Falls, a narrow, slightly run-down place called the Morning Plate, with a hand-painted sign above the door that had been faded by 3 consecutive summers and never repainted. Inside, there were 9 tables, a cracked vinyl booth in the corner, and a coffee machine that made a grinding sound every morning before 6, but somehow never fully broke down. Silas had bought the diner 8 years earlier with every dollar he had and a loan he had spent every day since trying to repay. Back then, he had a wife and a plan. Now he had a daughter and a different kind of plan, one built entirely around making sure she never felt the weight of what they were missing. Her name was Lily, and she was 8 years old. She had her father's dark eyes and her mother's habit of tilting her head slightly when she was thinking carefully about something. She was the kind of child who noticed things adults had learned to ignore, the way a stranger's shoes were worn unevenly at the heel, the expression on a dog's face when it was left outside in the rain, the precise moment a person stopped smiling with their whole face and started smiling only with their mouth. She was also, despite everything, relentlessly hopeful, which Silas considered either a miracle or proof that children understood something about the world that grown-ups had long forgotten. Every morning before school, Lily sat at the counter with a bowl of oatmeal and watched her father open the diner. And every morning, before he unlocked the front door or turned on the lights or started the coffee machine with its familiar grinding complaint, Silas did the same thing. He filled a paper cup with fresh coffee, strong, 2 sugars, exactly the way she had once told him. She liked it in one of her rare, unguarded moments, walked outside into whatever weather the morning had decided to offer, and handed it to the woman who sat on the low concrete step beside the lamppost at the corner of the building. Her name was Clara Hayes, though Silas did not know that for a long time. He knew only that she had been there the first morning he noticed her, sitting with her knees pulled close and a worn gray coat wrapped around her shoulders, staring at the pavement with an expression that was not quite sadness and not quite emptiness, but something in between. The look of a person who had made a decision that cost them everything and had not yet decided whether it was the right one. He had brought her coffee that first morning without much deliberation. He did it the next morning too, and then it simply became part of the routine, as unremarkable and essential as unlocking the door or starting the grill. Clara was somewhere in her mid-40s, though it was difficult to say with any certainty. Her hair was always tangled, her coat always the same worn gray, her shoes cracked at the seam above the left toe, but there was something about her eyes, dark, steady, unhurried, that did not match the rest of her. They were the eyes of someone who was not lost, someone who was looking. Weeks passed, and then months, and the ritual continued without interruption. Silas brought coffee every morning. Occasionally, on slower days, he would bring a paper bag with a biscuit or the leftover end of a loaf of bread. Once, in November, when the temperature dropped sharply overnight, he brought out a spare scarf that had been hanging on a hook in the back room since the previous winter. Clara accepted each thing without much ceremony, a small nod, sometimes a low murmur of thanks, and Silas never pressed for more. He did not ask her story. He did not offer advice or suggestions about shelters. He simply brought the coffee and went back inside, and that was enough. It was Lily who began to ask questions. "Why do you give her coffee every day?" she asked one morning in October, watching through the window as her father made his way back inside with the empty paper cup. Silas wiped down the counter. "Because she's out there every morning and nobody else does." Lily considered this with the particular seriousness she brought to things that mattered to her. "Does she have family?" "I don't know." "Does she have a name?" Silas paused. "Clara," he said. "Her name is Clara." Lily nodded slowly and went back to her oatmeal, satisfied. Over time, Clara began to open up in small ways. She asked about Lily when she had first seen the girl watching through the glass. She had said nothing, but the next morning she asked, quietly, how old she was. Silas told her 8. Clara nodded and said, with an air of genuine consideration, that 8 was a good age. She began to remember things: that Lily had a school play on a Thursday, that Silas had mentioned the coffee machine was acting up again, that the booth in the corner had finally gotten a new cushion. She noticed details in the way that only certain kinds of people do, people who are paying close attention for reasons they have not yet explained. Sometimes she said things that stayed with Silas long after the morning was over. "Most people look right through you," she said one cold Tuesday, her hands wrapped around the paper cup. "They don't mean to. They just never learn to look properly." Another time, watching a man in a sharp overcoat stride past without so much as a glance in her direction, she said almost to herself, "Not everyone who appears to have value actually does, and not everything that appears broken actually is." Silas did not respond to these observations. He did not know what to say. Not everyone in the neighborhood shared Silas's quiet generosity, and not everyone was quiet about it. Marcus Reed owned the hardware supply store 2 doors down from the Morning Plate, a squat, well-maintained building with a sign that was never faded and a sidewalk that was swept every morning before 7. Marcus was the kind of man who kept careful track of what the neighborhood looked like, because he believed firmly that appearances were the difference between success and failure. A philosophy he applied to everything, from his shop's window display to the people he chose to acknowledge when he stepped outside. He made his feelings about Clara known gradually, then, all at once. "You know what she does to foot traffic?" he said to Silas one morning in early December, stopping at the door of the Morning Plate with his arms crossed. "People see her sitting there and they keep walking. They don't want to deal with it. She's not hurting anyone," Silas said. "She doesn't have to hurt anyone. She just has to be there." Marcus shook his head with the practiced disappointment of a man who considered himself long-suffering. "You're running a business, Turner, not a charity. Start acting like it." Silas said nothing. Marcus walked away. But Marcus was not wrong about one thing. Business at the Morning Plate had been declining for months. A new breakfast chain had opened on the opposite end of Callaway Street in September, with exposed brick and oat milk and a menu printed on reclaimed wood, and it was pulling the younger crowd that Silas had once relied on for a steady mid-morning rush. The bank had called twice in 3 weeks. The loan repayment schedule, which had always been tight, was now genuinely precarious. Silas had started doing the math on napkins at night after Lily went to bed, and the numbers never came out well. The worst morning came on a Thursday. A private security guard from the new development, being built 3 blocks over, had apparently been tasked with keeping the immediate area around the construction site looking presentable. No one was entirely sure whose authority he was operating under, but he was large and wore an expression that suggested he did not welcome clarification on the matter. He found Clara at her usual spot beside the lamppost, and he told her she needed to move on. Clara did not move quickly enough for his satisfaction. Silas came out the front door at the sound of raised voices and saw the guard gripping Clara's arm, not gently, and steering her off the step. He stepped forward without entirely deciding to put himself between them, and said in a voice that was steadier than he felt that the woman was not on the construction site's property, and he would appreciate it if she were treated with basic decency. The guard shoved him. Not hard enough to knock him down entirely, but enough to send him stumbling backward against the wall of his own diner. Lily, who had been watching through the window, pressed her palm flat against the glass. Her face had gone very still. When Silas came back inside, she was still standing at the window. She looked at him with those dark, precise eyes of hers and asked the question in a voice that was almost too careful. "You help people," she said. "Why does that make other people want to hurt you?" Silas did not have an answer. He crouched down and held her close and did not say anything at all. Some questions, he had learned, were not asked in order to be answered. They were asked so that both people in the room could know they were feeling the same thing. Clara disappeared on a Friday. Not in a dramatic way, she simply was not at her usual spot when Silas came out that morning with the coffee. He set the cup down on the step anyway and went back inside, telling himself she had probably moved to a different block or found shelter somewhere. But when she was absent on Saturday too, and then again on Sunday, something shifted in him that he could not quite explain. He found himself watching the door more than usual. He caught himself thinking about her during the lunch service, when the diner was at its noisiest, and he should have been focused entirely on the grill. He walked past her spot on his way back from the supply run Monday afternoon, glancing down at the concrete as though she might have left something behind. She had, tucked under the base of the lamp post, folded once and weighted down by a small stone, was a piece of paper torn from a brown paper bag. The handwriting was clean and deliberate, far more composed than anything he might have expected. Asterisk. Thank you for seeing me. That was all it said. He stood on the sidewalk for a long moment, paper in hand, reading those 4 words more times than was necessary. Then he folded it carefully and put it in his shirt pocket. Lily noticed it at dinner. "There's something in your pocket," she said. "I know," he said. She waited. When he didn't continue, she tilted her head and said, "Is it about Clara?" He looked at her. "How did you know?" "Because you've been looking at the front door all day," she said, even when nothing was out there. He unfolded the note and read it to her. Lily was quiet for a moment, the way she was when she was processing something carefully. Then she said, "She noticed that you were different." 2 days later, a man Silas had never seen before came into the morning plate during the quiet window between breakfast and lunch. He was well dressed in an understated way, a dark overcoat, polished shoes, the kind of watch that did not draw attention to itself but communicated clearly to anyone who knew what they were looking at. He sat at the counter and ordered black coffee and did not look at his phone. When Silas set the cup down in front of him, the man looked up and asked, in a conversational tone that was almost too casual, whether Silas happened to know a woman who sometimes sat outside. "Older coat," the man said. "Gray, quiet, sat by the lamppost." Silas studied him for a moment. "She a friend of yours?" The man smiled in the way that some people smile when they are choosing not to answer a direct question. "Something like that," he said. He drank his coffee, left a generous tip, and walked out. Silas watched him go. The air in the diner felt different after that, slightly charged, the way it does before a storm that hasn't announced itself yet. The cold front that moved through Denton Falls in the 3rd week of December arrived without much warning. Overnight, temperatures dropped sharply, and the morning streets had a gray, brittle quality that made the whole neighborhood look like a photograph taken without enough light. Silas was at the grill by 5:45, as always. Lily was still asleep. The coffee machine made its grinding sound and then settled into its familiar rhythm. At 6:30, Silas filled a paper cup, put on his jacket, and walked outside. Clara was not there. He set the cup down on the step anyway. Then he straightened up and stood for a moment in the cold, watching his breath disappear into the pale air, and thought about the note in his shirt pocket, which he had moved to his wallet sometime in the past week without consciously deciding to. He was still standing there at 6:42 when he heard the sound. It came from the far end of Calloway Street, a low, rolling sound, the kind that precedes something large and unhurried. He looked up. 3 black SUVs were moving slowly down the street in a loose formation, their windows dark. their pace deliberate in the way of vehicles that are accustomed to having space made for them. They pulled up along the curb directly in front of the morning plate, one after another, and stopped. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the doors opened. The men who stepped out were not the kind of men one typically saw on Calloway Street. They wore dark suits that fit properly, which was noticeable in a neighborhood where most men's clothes fit as though they had been bought for someone slightly different. Two of them wore earpieces. They moved with a focused efficiency, fanning out slightly, their eyes moving across the street in quick, systematic sweeps, doorways, rooftops, parked cars. Marcus had stepped out of his hardware store at the sound of the engines. He was now standing on the sidewalk with his coffee mug frozen halfway to his mouth. The man, who appeared to be in charge, tall, late 40s, with a square jaw and an expression that suggested he was rarely surprised, walked directly toward Silas. He stopped a few feet away and looked at him with an appraising focus, as though he was confirming something he had already been told. "Mr. Turner," he said. It was not a question. Silas kept his hands loose at his sides. "That's me. My name is Raymond Holt. I work for Miss Hayes." The small crowd that had gathered, 3 people on foot, Marcus with his coffee mug, the young woman who ran the dry cleaner 2 doors down, had gone completely quiet. Silas could feel their attention like a physical presence. "I brought her coffee in the mornings," Silas said carefully. "I don't know if that counts as contact." Raymond Holt studied him for another moment. Then something shifted almost imperceptibly in his expression, not quite warmth, but a slight relaxation. "She's here," he said. He looked past Silas. Silas turned. She was walking from the side street that ran along the north end of the building, and she was not shaking. The gray coat was gone. In its place was a long, dark coat, well cut, the kind that moved smoothly with each. Her hair, which had always been tangled and loose, was pulled back cleanly. Her posture was straight. Her hands, which had always held the coffee cup with both palms as though drawing warmth from something fragile, were now at her sides, steady, unhurried. But it was her eyes that stopped him. The same eyes, dark, calm, and watching him with the same quality of careful attention that he had always noticed, but now undiluted by circumstance, completely visible for the first time, and unmistakably the eyes of someone who was exactly where she had chosen to be. Raymond Holt said, quietly, "Miss Hayes." The dry cleaner's owner made a sound. Marcus Reed's coffee mug tilted in his hand. Silas said nothing. He stood very still. "Clara, Miss." Hayes stopped a few feet from him, and for a moment neither of them spoke. The street was entirely silent. "I owe you an explanation," she said. Her voice was different too, or perhaps not different, only no longer restrained. Clearer, more grounded, and probably an apology, though I'm still deciding about the apology. "Who are you?" Silas asked. It was Raymond who answered, with the practiced neutrality of someone reading from a prepared statement. "Clara Hayes is the principal shareholder and chief executive of Hayes Global Industries, a privately held investment and property development firm with assets in 12 states. He paused. "She has been absent from public life for approximately 4 months. The words settled over the street like weather. Marcus Reed set his coffee mug down on the nearest surface with exaggerated care and stared at the woman he had twice referred to, within earshot of Silas, as a neighborhood problem. "You were testing people," Silas said. It came out quieter than he intended. Clara looked at him directly. "Yes," she said. There was no apology in her tone, not yet. "I was." What followed was not a conversation that was ever meant to happen on a sidewalk on Calloway Street, but Clara had always had a particular indifference to conventional settings, which was, as Raymond Holt could have told anyone, among the least surprising things about her. She asked Silas if she could come inside. He held the door. Lily, who had come downstairs during the commotion and was now sitting at the counter in her school clothes with her oatmeal cooling in front of her, looked at the woman who walked through the door and then looked at her father and then looked back at the woman. She said nothing. She did not need to. Her expression said everything that she had always suspected. This particular story was not yet finished. Clara sat down at the counter. Raymond positioned himself near the door. Silas stood behind the counter and waited. "I've been watching you for a long time," Clara said. "Not just here. I had people doing background work. Your finances, your history, the way you treat your employees, the way you spoke to the people who came in here." She folded her hands on the counter. "I watched everyone on this block." She told him about the cameras, small, discreet, placed in locations that no one would think to look. She told him about the reports that were filed every week, detailed, factual, unsentimental. She told him about the people who had looked through her, the ones who had told her to move, the guard who had shouted at her in the rain one evening in November. She told him about Marcus. Marcus, who was still visible through the window, appeared to sense that he was being discussed. He had retreated slightly toward his shop door but had not yet gone inside. "There were several people on this street," Clara said, "who had business arrangements with my company through holding entities' rental agreements, supply contracts, minor development deals." She paused. They didn't know that. Most people don't bother to trace ownership very far back. She looked at Silas steadily. "You are the only person on this street who never once asked me what I needed or whether I had anywhere to go. Not because you didn't care, but because you understood that what I actually needed in that moment was for someone to treat me like a person rather than a problem to be solved." She was quiet for a moment. "You brought me coffee, and you went back inside, and you did it again the next day." Silas leaned against the counter behind him and crossed his arms. He was looking at her with an expression that was not gratitude, not yet, and not entirely, but something more complicated, something that was working through the surprise toward a question he had not quite formulated yet. "What do you want from me, Miss Hayes?" he said. "I want to invest in this diner," she said. "I want to give you the capital to renovate, expand, and carry you through the next 18 months while you rebuild your customer base. Full equity agreement, fair terms, nothing hidden." The room was quiet. Outside, one of the SUVs idled softly. "And what do you get?" Silas said. "A return on my investment," Clara said. "Eventually, and the satisfaction of having done something that was not motivated entirely by profit for once." She paused. "Which is more valuable to me at this point than you might think." Silas looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "No." Raymond Holt's head moved a fraction. Clara went very still. "Excuse me?" she said. "I said no." Silas uncrossed his arms and put his hands flat on the counter. His voice was entirely even. "I don't want someone to invest in me because they feel they owe me something. I appreciate what you're saying, and I appreciate that whatever this was, I appreciate that you trusted me enough to come back and explain it. But I'm not going to take money that's being offered out of obligation. That's not a partnership. That's a debt in a different shape." The silence stretched. Then, from the end of the counter, a small voice said, "He helped you because you were a person, not because you were rich or important, or because he wanted something." Lily set down her spoon. "If you give him money because you think you owe him, that's treating it like a transaction." And it wasn't a transaction. Clara looked at the girl. Something moved across her face that had not been there before. Something unguarded, unexpected, that the 4 months of careful observation and controlled experiment had not prepared her for. Her eyes went bright, and she blinked once, and then she looked down at the counter for a moment. When she looked up again, there were tears at the corners of her eyes. She did not wipe them away. "She's right," Clara said softly. "I know she's right. So let me say it differently." She looked at Silas. "I don't want to give you money. I want to build something with you. Equal partners. You run the operation. You know this neighborhood. You know this business. You know what it needs. I provide the capital and the infrastructure. We split the decisions, and we split the returns." She paused. "No debt. No obligation. A real partnership between two people who have both earned it." Silas was quiet for a long time. He looked at Lily. She tilted her head slightly, her thinking expression, and then gave him a small, precise nod. He looked back at Clara. "All right," he said. The renovation of the Morning Plate began in January and took 6 weeks. The hand-painted sign above the door was restored, not replaced, but carefully repainted by a woman who specialized in historic signage, who matched the original lettering and the original color exactly. Inside, the booths were reupholstered in a warm cognac leather. The floors were refinished, the kitchen was modernized without losing its character. The coffee machine was replaced with something that did not make a grinding sound. The new Morning Plate opened on a Tuesday in mid-February to a line that stretched most of the way down Calloway Street. It was not the exposed brick breakfast chain's line, it was a different kind. People from the neighborhood, most of them, who had been waiting to see what the place would become. A local food writer covered the reopening in a piece that ran the following Sunday, and the piece mentioned not just the food, which was excellent, but the story of how the renovation had come about. The writer got several details wrong, in the way that writers sometimes do when a story is more interesting than complicated. But the essential truth of it remained intact. Silas became the managing partner of what would, over the following 18 months, grow into 3 locations. He hired a small staff that he treated with the same uncomplicated decency he had always applied to everything. He paid down the bank loan in full by the end of the year. Marcus Reed lost his rental agreement on the hardware supply store in March. The property, it turned out, was part of a commercial portfolio held by a Hayes Global subsidiary, and when the lease came up for renewal, it was not extended. Marcus did not understand at first why, and then he did, and he said nothing publicly because there was nothing to say. He relocated to a strip mall on the far side of town, where the foot traffic was different and the mornings were quieter. Clara came back to Calloway Street once a month, sometimes more, when there were decisions to discuss. She never came with the black SUVs she drove herself, in a vehicle that would not have attracted any particular attention, and she always came in through the front door like everyone else and sat at the counter. Raymond Holt had apparently resigned himself to this arrangement with the quiet stoicism of someone who had been doing so for a long time. Lily, who had an opinion about most things and was not shy about sharing it, appointed herself the arbiter of Clara's coffee orders. She kept a small, unofficial record of exactly how Clara had taken her coffee on each visit. 2 sugars the first time, then 1 sugar 2 visits later, then back to 2, then black for a brief and apparently experimental period in April. Lily presented this information to her father one evening with the solemnity of a case file. "She hasn't decided yet," Lily said. "Decided what?" Silas asked. "What she likes," Lily said. "She's still figuring things out." She said it without any particular judgment, in the tone of someone observing a natural process, and went back to her homework. Silas stood at the kitchen counter for a moment, considering this assessment, and found that he agreed with it. It was a morning in late spring, the air warm enough for the front door to be propped open, the street carrying the particular quality of light that only comes in the early hours before the city has fully committed to the day, when Clara arrived a little before 7 and sat down at the counter and looked at the new coffee machine with a thoughtful expression. Silas was already behind the counter. He poured a cup without asking 2 sugars, because that was where she had settled after the experimental black coffee phase, and set it in front of her. She looked at it. Then she looked at him. "You know," she said, "this is the first time I've had to pay for this." Silas leaned his forearms on the counter and considered her with the unhurried attention of someone who has learned not to fill silences that don't need filling. "You don't have to pay," he said. "Not for this one." Clara raised an eyebrow. "Why not? Partners drink free," he said. "That's always been the rule." "There was no such rule," she said. "You just made that up." "I make the rules now," he said. "I'm the managing partner." She smiled a real smile, not the measured, controlled expression she had worn during those first careful months, but something that reached all the way. "You are," she said. From the back booth, where she had settled in with a book and what remained of her breakfast before school, Lily looked up. She observed the two of them for a moment with her precise, unhurried attention. Then the corner of her mouth moved in the particular way it did when she had been right about something and did not intend to make a production of it. She went back to her book. The morning light moved across the counter. The street outside was waking up, slowly, in the way that streets do when the day has not yet demanded anything from anyone. Silas refilled Clara's cup without being asked, and Clara wrapped both hands around it the way she used to on the cold concrete step outside, and for a moment neither of them said anything. There are things that cannot be fully explained in terms of what they are or what they led to. They can only be understood by the weight they carry, the quiet they contain, and the quality of the silence two people are able to share without needing to name it. This was one of those things. Outside, Calloway Street went on with its morning, unhurried and ordinary and entirely unaware that inside the morning plate, something had already been decided, not loudly, not with ceremony, but the way the most important things always are, one cup of coffee at a time, in the presence of a child who had known it all along, and in the particular warmth of a room where people had learned finally, and at some cost, to look at each other properly.